Welcome back to the spookiest podcast, the 706 podcast, the podcast where we debate, argue, and discuss which movies are the scariest 706 of all time. After watching The Empty Man and Monkey Shines, we are here in our third annual tradition of horror fright and discussing 1985's film Fright Night, directed by Tom Holland of Spider-Man fame, in which a young boy realizes a vampire has moved in next door and the situation evolves from there. Now, I think the best way to do this is to say, I'm your host, Anthony, but we're going to go around and introduce ourselves and then quickly go into the takes, the discussion, the horror, the scares that we've all experienced tonight. So let's start with Tony.
Hello, and I am the terrifying Tony tonight.
All right, and Connor?
I am the COVID-ridden Connor. I actually did get COVID. And I'm dressed as the scientist from Monkey Shines, by the way.
Nice. And last, Kirk?
Yes, hello. My name is Kirk. As far as something spooky, perhaps, I'm drawing a blank. Maybe I can tap into my spooky side throughout the film.
Yes,
but I will see. Maybe I'll do my M. Night Shyamalan impression later.
All right, classic terrifying Kirk, the scariest of them all. So I think we ended up choosing, or Tony ended up choosing Fright Night after a couple of years. I named Monkey Shines and The Empty Man as kind of, well, Monkey Shines being a kind of traditional B classic, a sort of comedic, maybe kind of movie, versus The Empty Man, a kind of dark, sinister, very allegorical, very metaphorical movie. Tony wanted, though, something a bit more traditional. So I don't know if we fully satisfied that tonight, or maybe we did. And we'll figure that out with what Tony has to say. So, Tony, how did you feel about the movie? And it was your first time watching it, I believe.
That is correct. I just did a quick Google about Tom Holland and see what else he did. Not a lot of great picks there from what I can tell. However, it does look like he directed Child's Play, which as a child, the box, the VHS cover, like horrified and traumatized me. So I still need to see it. I do want to see it. But so that might be the only other Tom Holland film I check out based on what else he's got. But yes, this was my first time seeing Fright Night. I was mainly familiar with it from the poster, which is probably one of the best posters of all time. It's a pretty baller poster. If you've not seen it, please Google it.
Describe it real quick and why you think it's so great.
Oh God, it's a house with a scary face above it in the clouds. That's my best description of it. But if you actually look at it, it's just a great 80s. Like movie posters are so much worse now than they used to be. Like they used to go really hard and actually hire an artist to do it, not just Photoshop the actors' faces below the title. But I digress. But yes, this was my first time seeing Fright Night, and I really enjoyed it. It was really fun. This is basically exactly what I wanted when I said like a more traditional kind of Halloween movie. This is about as like classic of like, this is a classic like Halloween movie. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of horror movies out there. Like Connor's made this point that horror and Halloween are not totally synonymous. You know, there are horror movies that aren't really Halloween movies. There are Halloween movies that aren't really horror movies. And I'll give him that. I think that's true. This is a really classic Halloween horror movie. You know, it's from the 80s and it's just a lot of fun. It's got some great scares. It's pretty funny. I think it took me a good like 20 minutes or so to kind of settle in. I think that initially, like I thought it was very goofy. Just some of the acting is a little silly and some of the reactions are a little over the top. But I think though that ultimately it works, and as soon as I kind of got into the rhythm and got on the movie's wavelength, that stopped bothering me and added to kind of its charm, because the movie opens with like a shot of the TV playing these old, you know, B vampire movies, you know, which is almost sort of a coy little nod or sort of a meta moment, sort of to say this is kind of the tradition we're working in and kind of setting our expectations, you know, accordingly. But I just love the whole escalation of him seeing the vampire, investigating it, trying to get people on board. It's just classic, bread and butter, 80s horror stuff. And I think the visuals are just great. The whole nightclub scene is just awesome. Just pure 80s joy. I loved him hopping into the kitchen. There's this alley with this giant window with no glass, and you can just hop into the kitchen of this nightclub, which is great. I think more nightclubs should be run and operated this way. Although they probably should have had a vampire policy. They seem to not know what to do in that situation. But when he's just, messing people up in the club, I'm like, this is great. This is like Collateral. This is the 80s Collateral, clearly. But just like the visuals of just like the fog and the really bright, really direct light that you see a lot in the 80s, and it's an aesthetic we almost associate with like music videos. And again, if you tried to do it today, it would probably just look really cheesy, but in its time and place, there's just something so perfect about it. There's something so just perfectly atmospheric and heightened and so Halloween about it, And I thought the finale was great. The effects, the visual practical effects were, I thought, on point, and I thought it was a fun horror romp. So that's it for now.
All right, thanks, Tony. I will say before we go to Connor, I got to stick up for Mr. Tom Holland's filmography real quick. So Child's Play, throw it out the window. It's troubling, awful stuff. Could never stand the Chucky movies. But, and this is a true Anthony take right here, he is most famous outside of Child's Play for probably being the writer who was willing to write Psycho 2, which has nothing to do with the book. That was the sequel to, of course, the book that the movie was based on. Psycho 2 is an underrated film. It's not great. It's not on par with the original, of course, but it's a very, very strong movie from him, and I'd recommend it, actually. Maybe one day we'll do it on the podcast. But anyway, we'll go from there. So thanks, Tony. Let's do Connor then next.
Okay, I'm definitely curious about Psycho 2 and Tom Holland's other expanded filmography. But as for Fright Night, what can I say? It was a delight. The casting was just right. The screenplay was tight. The lighting, as Tony said, was bright. Et cetera, et cetera. But no, actually, I could have got. I had like 16 more of those, by the way. But I'm going to stop right there to say that. Well, I guess I would agree with Tony's like initial impression that he found it goofy. There's something kind of off about it. And I felt that overall, there was something kind of like that just didn't quite hit me. The kind of the balance of the horror and this kind of the silliness kind of didn't quite come through. I felt like the characters were just like 2 shades too stupid, like in this movie, or too inconsistent, too unlike us, too kind of foolish. And, I just like, I couldn't put myself in the perspective of that boy seeing this vampire appear, like, and they go into this direction where they take it into the camp universe, okay, where they bring in Vincent's his last name. It's not Vincent Price, but it's
Peter Vincent.
Peter Vincent, excuse me, who is like the horror host and former like star of horror B movies. So you think they're trying to go in that direction of a kind of a knowing, kind of postmodern, a kind of like a self-aware idea of, and we've seen this in so many other genres, the idea of like where the hero of this genre picture is aware of the very genre that he's in, that kind of thing. And like they're kind of commenting on that. And they kind of do that a little bit with Peter Vincent, but it's just like, it just never comes through in like a very particularly clever way. I mean, it ends up just being like a traditional like vampire plot, updated for the 80s. And that was interesting. But, like I was definitely like I was not on the movie's like wavelength, okay, until we get almost like more than halfway into the movie. We get these weird scenes, these kinds of flights of fancy, these vignettes that I didn't understand what I was watching. I didn't understand why I was seeing what I was seeing. For instance, the very extended kind of seduction scene in the club, very uncomfortable, obviously, because of the age gap between the vampire and the girl. Very uncomfortable. The movie seems to be completely on board with how sexy Chris Sarandon is, in a way that's just very off-putting. But it just goes on and on and on. And honestly, it kind of won my goodwill. It was such a bold choice. I was just like, oh my God, like I can't believe what I'm seeing. That it came around to the schlock fun, it came back again in that form. Or again, the other one is Evil Ed, who I found like impossible to watch. I found him just extremely uncomfortable. Anytime he's on screen, I'm just like, I just want to look away. But then they give him this like 2 minute, 3 minute long agonizing death scene with Peter Vincent, with Roddy McDowall just kind of looking on and just barely reacting to what's going on. And that was just so insane and so inexplicable that I ended up kind of liking it. There ended up being a real fun factor in the end for me. And a lot of that was like the practical effects too. But it didn't come until like halfway through the movie. Otherwise, I feel like it's kind of just schlocky and kind of not very thoughtful and not very smart writing. But I can't deny that, like, especially that last part of the movie and some of those weird, bizarre choices and some of those practical effects, I must admit, do kind of redeem it in the end. But I'm definitely more negative than Tony is. I don't quite get like the pure cult following. I guess maybe, Anthony can draw that out for me, why people love this movie, but I'm not quite sold on it just yet.
All right, fair enough. I think before we move on, I got to say this now before I forget. In Fright Night 2, the sequel to this movie, there's a hilarious moment in which our main character is essentially suffering from PTSD out of losing Evil Ed. And it's this whole part where this therapist has to convince him that Peter Vincent killed his friend out of self-defense. And it's this hilarious plot line that just keeps going. But anyway, that's not relevant to this necessarily this episode. The other thing is, since Tony brought it up as well, we got to give credit to Evelyn King's song "Give It Up," which plays over the dance scene. It's a great 80s song. However you feel about the movie, however you feel about the scene. But let's go to Kirk. Very curious. He's the researcher of the team. He's been doing a lot of work. He's been writing essays. Let's hear what he has to say.
Contacting all the various critics of the time and the actors. I have some really great quips to share, but what is there to say? I don't really know how to comment on this movie by itself without commenting on just the broader genre or culture that kind of informs a project like this. I don't know. I know there are so many very ardent like supporters and people who would just lash back at you if you were to, utter one foul word toward any sort of classic, horror Halloween film such as this. They love it. The goofier, the campier, the better. I wonder why these movies, what is horror supposed to do, right? It's supposed to elicit an emotional response, correct? Like a fear response. It's supposed to activate our sympathetic nervous system. At least in my opinion, right? I don't know. If I watch porn, if I watch porn, I'm looking to be aroused, right? If I watch horror, I'm looking to be scared. And there's just this vast swath of these types of films, that don't scare me at all. They make me laugh more than they make me fearful. And this is one of those examples. So I don't really think I have a problem with the movie itself. I just have a problem with the notion of like horror films. And, I guess some people could be, it's more grotesque than anything. Like some of those extended death scenes are really brutal. It's kind of reminded me of Evil Dead that we watched maybe 2 years ago. But for me, I think one of the issues I had with the script itself is it didn't really go anywhere. I read somewhere in my hours of research that Tom Holland had this idea, like a one sentence, like, what if a guy lived next door to a vampire and nobody believed him, and that's it. How many revisions did the script go through? What, like a fucking rough draft and then straight to press? there's no creativity in the script beyond that initial idea. Where are the twists and turns? I could have predicted actually every single thing that happened in this movie. What do we get? We get like 40 seconds of some melodic piano while Peter Vincent considers the fact that he's a fraud. And then our main character, I forget his name, is Brewster, is meant to convince him that he's needed. We need you. We need you to save Anna or Amy. And that's pretty much it. I was hoping, like, maybe I'm spoiled by HBO, right? I was hoping he was going to tell us some story about how his niece, fell victim to human trafficking, and then he started getting into horror as a coping mechanism, and he's actually like, it turns him on in some weird way, and there's none of that. I don't know. I just feel like, yeah, the vibes. This is a vibe movie. This is very much about vibes. This is very much about the provenance of the genre. I think my biggest single gripe with the movie itself, and I'm trying to separate the genre and the movie, right? My single biggest gripe with the movie itself is that it lays everything out on the table right at the beginning. The vampire Dandridge, Chris Sarandon, he's inside Brewster's house. He's inside the kid's house. He basically has him in a stranglehold. It's like, usually in horror films, there's layers of protection, right? And those layers were wiped out. And there's also usually information that gradually becomes revealed, right? It would, to me, I feel like maybe that's my modern sensibilities, but if we could have had more kind of ambiguity surrounding the actual identity of the next door neighbor, right? Like, and then some self-doubt could creep in. But he never was afforded the ability to doubt himself because he was just so explicitly a vampire. Like, there was never a chance for him to not be a vampire. And so then it became just this game of cat and mouse. So really there wasn't much of a psychological element to it. I think this movie could have easily been 80 minutes. I don't know why it's 106. Some of those scenes are so extended. The dance scene was pretty cool. I'll give it that. I couldn't stop thinking that Chris Sarandon was like Bobby Cannavale's brother because they look exactly the same.
I thought Mark Ruffalo.
Oh, Mark Ruffalo, sure. Yeah, I mean, they all kind of have the same facial structure, but oh gee, I think for what it is, the last 30 minutes is where it really shines. I think, kind of like what Connor said, it just totally throws all apprehension out the window, and it really goes for it, and I appreciate that. I would have liked some more intrigue, some more mystery, some more twists and turns to kind of keep me guessing or feel like I didn't know exactly what was going to happen. I don't like in a film where that the vampire is going to, the bad guy's going to die, right? I didn't feel like there was any chance that Dandridge was going to, reign victorious in this film. I just didn't get that vibe. But yeah, I don't know. What can I say? I guess I'm a little bit meh on it. I'm interested to hear what Anthony, I want to hear you justify your pick. I'd like to, hear a little bit more. I'm sure you're more well versed in kind of the history or the historical context of this film. So I'm interested to hear more on
that. Sure. So we got Kirk's meh. We got Tony's slightly more positive than Connor's, to use Connor's sentence there. And so different kind of reactions all around. I think the way to go about how and why I'd nominate this movie for the Halloween episode, to me, I'd agree with Connor. I don't think the script is always as smart as it could be, which I think is perfectly fine. I think, though, there's so many other opportunities where this movie could end up a lot worse. And just to iterate, the much worse version is the remake from 2011 starring Colin Farrell and David Tennant. David Tennant plays the Peter Vincent role as a kind of sexy modern day vampire hunter, modeled after Chris Angel, the magician. The movie's relocated to Vegas, so there is a cool Vegas setting if you're interested in that. Colin Farrell, of course, plays the vampire next door. Anton Yelchin plays our main character. McLovin from Superbad plays Evil Ed. And we got Imogen Poots as a feistier and quote unquote more sexually aggressive girl in this modern adaptation. And what we're left with is kind of a mess. Now, I say all this not to defend the 1985 version, but to understand that I think a little context is necessary, Kirk, which is one, I think the key in some ways to the movie is kind of like you're saying, a sort of vibe, kind of to embrace its camp at times. And now 85, it means this movie comes along in kind of the middle of this great horror renaissance, as some people call it, the big run of slasher films, especially the kind of origin of that, which now feels especially played out, I think, today. But in 78, 79, we get the Halloween. We start getting the Friday the 13th movies in 1980. Evil Dead 1 comes out in 80, 81. Evil Dead 2 will be in 87. John Carpenter has his great run of horror movies in the 80s on. So we have in the middle of this kind of run Fright Night. And I think the key is in the middle of the film when a character says kids today are sort of tired out by vampires and they're so used to slashers and, you know, the kind of phrase there. And I love this line because I feel like you hear it today in various things. And it's this kind of quotidian notion, right? That we're constantly having to up ourselves to scare ourselves, that we're constantly used to new sensations, that the old stuff isn't left to kind of horrify us anymore. And yet, the more I watch horror movies, especially, maybe besides any other genre besides comic book or maybe like action, if you want to classify it that way, the horror genre is really probably the most typified by trope, typified by cliches. And some of the best horror movies that really unsettle me, if we want to take that definition for horror, are also some of the most predictable things I've seen. I don't watch necessarily, and when I rewatch something like The Strangers, which is a movie that still disturbs me, it has some of the elements that usually make up cheesier horror movies, a lot of jump scares, a lot of horrific moments. It's the ambiguity of that movie that leaves me terrified. When I go to something like Fright Night, one of the things that I find pleasure in, and this is the opposite of how you were describing it, Kirk, is that I do expect to know everything along the way because you know what? The vampire genre, the horror genre is in some ways kind of meant for that. And in some ways is kind of able to excel despite that. And what I think with Fright Night is trying to do is, of course, offer a kind of preliminary example of something like Scream. It doesn't get as smart as it, but it allows us to, one, do a kind of nostalgic throwback while at the same time poking fun at some of the kind of common elements that we're used to thinking about horror. It gives us a hero to root for again. It gives us kind of a campy villain to both fall in love with or be seduced by, depending on how you feel. And it gives us just a great group of teenagers to kind of rally together. These kind of, who, in my opinion, I actually differ from Connor with, I find kind of miserable and terrible human beings in a way that I think teenagers really are, is my own kind of opinion on that front. And so it may just be a vibes question. It may just be, do you want the kind of twist and turns? Because this movie is not going to offer it. It's going to give you the kind of throwback. It's going to give you a kind of early glimpse of something kind of meta that's going to be more common in the 90s and late 80s, especially in kind of the horror film genre. Now, in terms of other context, this movie was a minor hit. It made triple its budget, but it did have a huge cult audience. It, of course, garnered enough to warrant a sequel. Tom Holland actually wrote a sequel to that movie recently in a book. So it has its kind of grouping around, it has its following, but you know, it is at the end of the day that what it is, a kind of in some ways predictable movie, but I think there's enough moments that still grab me and I still really like. So that's kind of one of the fun reasons for choosing it. Now, actually, it's kind of a fun way. I don't know if we've done this before, but Kirk, let me ask, what horror movies or what movies or any kind of thing in any medium truly terrify or get you in a way that you think horror should?
It's a great question. I like that question. You know, I think for me, so we construct these totems that we can throw our fears and apprehension or our misgivings and our understanding of the social ills that plague our society, right? And you know, we look at things like Dracula and Frankenstein's monster, and we look at all the various horror kind of paragons, right? And I think for me, I like things that are more mimetic in that sense. I think there's so much to be afraid of in this world that we don't have to separate so much. So, a horror film for me that worked is definitely something like The Strangers, something for me that allows for suspense to be built. The Changeling was another great film, though that was more paranormal, but it was a very slow burn. So I like the idea of kind of almost in a sense being in a room with a candle and you're walking around and you have no idea what else is in that room. It's pitch black. And my main issue with this film is it flicked the fucking light switch on and started playing strobe, 80s Poison, Bret Michaels right away. But yeah, I don't know. There haven't been many movies that really have truly scared me, to be honest. But I feel like a film where like, a classic scenario would be like a home invasion. I think that's probably one of the most terrifying scenarios that I could envision, and going on from there. But yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. I think there is an element to Anthony is that I'm very desensitized, and you kind of alluded to this. Violence and gore. I think some people would find this movie scary just because of the gore, just because of the horrific transformations. Whereas for me, I find them kind of goofy and I find them impressive more than terrifying. But I've kind of grown past that. I mean, The Thing is another film that was very terrifying because you really don't know what's going on. And so I think that withholding information, it puts us in a vulnerable spot and it causes us to second guess ourselves. And I think we do that often in real life when we're afraid. So I think that in that way, like that lack of information really gets to me.
No, it's an interesting sort of thing to think about, I suppose. And I mean, to what end or to what extent should a horror movie terrify? Is kind of a going back and forth. But I don't know, it's kind of an interesting question. I mean, Connor, do you have a movie as someone who's not a huge horror person that you consider that, or and how would you classify Fright Night with the horror genre for someone like Kirk?
This is actually kind of blowing my mind, but thinking about it, it's like, what made me think it was like what Anthony said, like, yeah, I like a horror movie to like obey like conventions of the genre, which I agree is like, if there's any genre we can recognize in terms of conventions, it's horror, but like, shouldn't that be the complete opposite? If we want to be scared, we should want to be surprised, right? Isn't like kind of the unknown like an extremely important part of being scared? It's kind of like making me like rethink like, like even the very basic idea of horror, what it's supposed to do, if it's supposed to scare you or not. I mean, I think like, there are like plenty of movies that, do the jump scare thing. Okay. That's not so interesting. Right. But then there's movies where like, I'm trying to think of things that I'm really scared by, where I feel uncomfortable on the edge of my seat, frightened. I have to say, like the one that's coming to mind is not a horror movie, is a thriller, really, you would call it. Green Room, which I recommended for the podcast a long time ago, where it's like, I don't know what I'm watching to begin with. There is no kind of genre convention that supports my watching of this. There's no like background of like, I know what kinds of characters these are, like, oh, this kind of Nazis or whatever, but they're kind of Nazi punk characters who are like hard to predict what they're about, what they're doing. And it's like anyone seemingly could die. And like that is fundamentally unsettling. And there's something about the reality of it. And, that movie works a little bit like a horror movie in terms of how it presents and how it frightens you and scares you and makes you feel uncomfortable. But I agree that like as someone who's not into horror, I mean, I don't really seek out so many things that are, in the genre of just like scaring me in the way that Green Room scares me. Because I feel like that's not what horror is about. It's almost not about being scared, but I think it's, again, Tony raised my point of the difference between a Halloween and a horror movie. That's not really what, anyway, I'm stretching what he was saying versus what I'm saying, but like, I feel like, isn't like Halloween or horror in general about this kind of carnivalesque, kind of campy, kind of over the top. And also like, when I think of these horror movies, I mean, I think it's like these 80s practical effects extravaganzas occupy such a unique place, because they can kind of disgust you in a way. They can kind of, but it's not about being scared. It's about kind of being this, it's about entering into this, house of horrors, this kind of like, again, this kind of carnivalesque kind of just like you're entering into a different space. I don't know, like I'm totally losing words and I'm not sounding very intelligent right now, but it's like that to me is like, is so much more what horror is. And it's weird that in a movie like this, it's like, I mean, literally, like I was never scared for a second. Yeah. And in fact, I was even bored at moments, like, when the love interest character is revived, at the end, it's like, they couldn't even do that where they like, she's still a vampire, they've kind of like, they've broken their own rules that they set up, it's just like, it's like so predictable, so rote, that I'm just like, I'm yawning, but it's like, you're right. I mean, it's, we're not meant to be surprised, but anyway, so these are just unresolved issues that I'm sort of meditating upon vis-a-vis horror. But yeah, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, let me throw this to Tony too, since we're going around. It's kind of a fun thing to ask. I will say, like, as a final point into the movie before I forget, it's kind of interesting in the sense of, isn't there something to be said about not having a movie terrify us, but being able to think back to the characters themselves and realizing that what they're going through is terrifying in a way that harkens us back to kind of heightened senses of teenagehood, right? The girl that we like being seduced by the handsome older stranger, your best friend losing and suffering their life and having to take them out, your idol not being quite the idol that you expected it to be. It's a kind of typical way of coming of age and a way of the horror genre provides it. But anyway, let me go to Tony. How do you feel about all this?
I was thinking about it because it's an interesting question. I kind of get what Connor's saying with like Green Room, for example, which, incidentally, I have heard people describe it as a horror movie. And I thought it was odd. I'm like, because it doesn't, what we think of as a horror movie, it means it subscribes to certain tropes. We call something a horror movie not because it scares us, but because it, follows the rules for the horror movie and it's recognizable as such, because I'm kind of similar. Like, I'm very rarely am I scared by a movie, almost never, and as a kid I got scared by stuff a lot, and there was sort of a allure to it, like of that, like, the taste of something you can't quite handle yet, and like, but you also can't quite get enough. And I think maybe that as an adult I chase that high. Maybe I have those core memories from like of childhood of actually being scared and not being able to sleep because of an R.L. Stine story or something, so maybe that's what horror is for a lot of people, is that nostalgia and kind of taking you back to childhood and that feeling of vulnerability. But when I think about the movies that have truly scared me, I mean, in terms of actual like horror movies, like The Descent is one that I can think of where that terrified me when I first saw it. But the movies that have scared me the most have probably been like David Lynch movies, which no one really categorizes as horror, because the scary moments in David Lynch movies don't follow the horror tropes. They retain this kind of power of, kind of tapping into the unconscious. They're not recognizable as a movie. They tap into something deeper, like scenes like the first Frank Booth scene in Blue Velvet, or the Winky's Diner scene in Mulholland Drive, or one scene that like absolutely terrified me when I first saw it is the lady in the radiator scene in Eraserhead. Like, these are the things that like actually like freak me out and kind of make me uncomfortable when I'm watching them in a way that I never really see. But I don't really consider any of those movies horror movies, and I don't think so many people do. Which, as Connor says, is kind of an interesting and kind of counterintuitive idea. But like when I watch Fright Night, like I'm not scared, and I don't walk away disappointed that I wasn't scared. I walked in kind of knowing what to expect, and I was happy that I got what I expect, which might seem odd coming from me because I always like having my expectations subverted. I like to see radical, new, and colorful things. But I think there's something about, watching a movie from this era, this kind of, as Anthony said, kind of this golden age of horror, which has this very strong, very defined aesthetic, and being kind of taken away, to a different time and a different place. I think there's something very joyous about it. Seeing like the neon lights and seeing that alleyway with the fog, seeing the spooky house, seeing the practical effects, it just puts like a big smile on my face. And I think that like in terms of horror movies that like are trying to go for a more like unsettling thing, something like, like The Witch or something, or me and my girlfriend just watched Blair Witch Project again, I like stuff like that. But when I watch Fright Night, it signals to us very early on that that's not what it's doing, and that it's going for a kind of a different tone. And that's a tone that I very much welcome. And I mean, I think about like with jump scares, for example, like a lot of people hate on jump scares, and I have in the past, but a really good, a really well executed jump scare, I think, is one of the purest joys in cinema. Like I love like the ending of Monkey Shines when the monkey comes out of his back, which I forgot to say. I was going to joke initially that the only two horror movies that have scared me have been Monkey Shines and The Empty Man. But the ending of Monkey Shines where the monkey jumps out of his back really gets you, like it really makes you jump. But like immediately after, I just burst into laughter because it's such a stupid, like ridiculous moment. But I still love it. I like that. I love that moment in that movie, and that moment actually kind of elevates the whole movie almost retroactively, and it ends on such a high note. So I'm not sure what I'm saying exactly, but I guess to me, it's like there is a real pleasure to be found in horror outside of merely just like being scared, and I think that like that's something that's not remarked upon or acknowledged kind of enough among horror fans. You know what I mean? Like obviously, yes, ideally a horror movie will scare you, but as an adult, that doesn't happen too much, and it's usually something very unique and very special that does it. But yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, I would totally agree with the Winky's diner scene in Mulholland Drive, which gets me every time. And it's quote unquote a jump scare. But the way Lynch plays with sound to like prep that up, I just something about it still like freaks me out, despite the fact that I know it's coming, despite the fact I've seen that movie now quite a bit. But it's kind of like, and I guess I'm taking it away from Fright Night a bit with this, but I'm kind of fascinated. It's like you hear these stories of like when film was coming around, and it's an exaggerated story. Like people were terrified of like the train coming through the projector, and they dash, and obviously it's exaggerated, but like it's a kind of a horrific moment. Then you hear these things about people crying and passing out when like the original Frankenstein was there. Fast forward, we hear the same story with Psycho and Anthony Perkins and the reveal, and again with Halloween and 78. And all of a sudden those stories seem to have kind of disappeared, except in like marketing campaigns. Like maybe like 10 years ago, 14 years ago, I remember hearing some of that with like Paranormal Activity, where they didn't even show the movie, they showed the audience reaction to the movie. But at the same time, I think what Tony's getting at is even more correct, is in an age where we're so desensitized, the scariest things are going to be what we remember as kids. There's a great moment with Stephen King where he talks about how like people always come up to him and are like, the scariest books were like The Shining and like It, and all these early classics. They terrified me. And Stephen King says he always asked them when they read it, and they're always like 12, 13, and he's like, that's why it was so scary. And it's true. It's like you never quite get that back fully, I think. And I think if we were to really sit down and get at some of the scariest things today, we'd probably league or jump on something like The Hunt and the moral dilemma it presents us of being trapped in that, which is a totally different direction. Whereas Fright Night is going back to a sort of 50s nostalgia, even in the 80s. And yet I think from our vantage point, when we're so saturated with like 80s nostalgia and 90s nostalgia, it's kind of fun to sit at the back and realize that the same complaint was already happening, which is in an age of desensitization, playing into the tropes is kind of a fun, smart way of getting us going. So what that the hero's going to probably triumph, that this villain, this kind of quote unquote hot villain, is going to lose in the end. What we're left with is kind of the reminder of what horror kind of used to be. And I think that's great and kind of fun. Now, anyway, I know we're kind of getting late and ushering on, and we didn't get too much to the movie. But if anyone wants to throw anything out about the movie, if they change their opinion, if they want to bring up a scene, and we could also vote as we get to the end. Tony, do you want to go?
Sure, and I think that in their criticisms, I think Connor and Kirk both made some very good points. I do think that like, yeah, the writing isn't the most like watertight. There is some flub, there is some flab in the screenplay, some redundancies. One thing that really kind of stuck in my craw watching it is the number of times. What's our main character's name? whatever, Tom Holland himself, the number of times he wants to call the cops, even after he calls the cops at the beginning and they laugh him off. Like, really, he just shouldn't. Like, I understand why he did it initially, although even then it kind of beggars belief that he's like insisting he's a vampire. Don't you believe me? It's like, obviously no. Why would anybody ever believe you? But then he keeps trying to call the cops, and it's like, you haven't learned your lesson. And then at the end of the movie, he's like, no, we can't call the cops. They won't believe us. And it's like, yeah, you called them like 3 minutes ago. Don't act all like, that's like the 12-year-old boy. It's like, oh, you think Santa's real? And he found out like 2 days prior, it's kind of like that.
The movie is really a deep metaphor, Tony, about how even white people can't trust the institution of police.
Yeah. And the first officer we see is actually black, in a clever statement about the state of race relations in 1980s America. I actually wrote a book specifically on the race relations in Fright Night, despite not having seen it. So you can check that out on Amazon. It's getting some pretty bad reviews, honestly, but I think it's biased, But yeah,
too niche.
Exactly. So yeah, so I think this movie has its flaws, to be sure. But my moment to moment experience of watching it is still like extremely positive. What can I say? I can admit the flaws, I can concede them, and still say that, when I walk away from it, I thought it was a lot of fun. And I think that, like, for what it is, for what it is designed to do, which is give you like a fun time with your friends on Halloween, this is like a very solid choice. And I think, well, deserving of the kind of 80s horror canon. I'll vote yes. I'll vote yes on Fright Night.
Let's see. This is tough. Kirk, why don't you go? And if you want to respond to anything I said too, or anything anyone said, I suppose.
No, earlier I was thinking of another film that terrified me or really unsettled me. Open Water. I don't know if anybody saw that. 2 scuba divers get stranded in the middle of the ocean. I mean, talk about terrifying. That actually did happen, by the way. But as far as the movie itself, yeah, points well taken, right? What is the genre? Is it really even meant to scare us? I wonder. It must have started that way, right? Like, and I think we fell away from that. But I do think there are opportunities to be scared still, though it is far harder. It surely is. And part of me wonders if there's kind of like an implicit satisfaction with knowing that you can withstand whatever a movie will throw at you. And I think people do, like horror fanatics really kind of take to that. The idea that like, this is nothing, I got this. And you kind of you're like a warrior, right? You're battle tested.
It's like eating spicy food, basically.
Yeah, exactly. The capsaicin popping off. So, well, I mean, Anthony, I appreciate the choice. I think the last half hour did redeem it to an extent. Like it'll be a movie I'll, kind of remember fondly to an extent about in relation to this kind of Hollywood genre or subculture or whatever it is, industry, really, industrial complex. I mean, Halloween has just been built out so much in recent years. Everybody is just fucking fanatical for Halloween. That's just something that I feel like is newer, but maybe not. I will vote no, because I don't think it's one of the 706 greatest films of all time. I think we have better examples of what this movie was trying to do, and we can find them at a later date. But it was a fun late October watch for sure. I'll say that it was fun. Some funny moments and some bewildering moments, but also some kind of creepy. I'll give it the creepy element. I think for sure.
Cool. There's a great sketch from Key and Peele in which they play 2 bros that are constantly trying to say that they're not scared about certain horror movies, and it just like keep one-upping each other the whole time about why they weren't scared. It's a great reflective moment of what you were saying, Kirk. Okay, but Connor, cast the deciding vote. How do you feel? How do you react?
This is tough. So I'm still like grappling with like the big theme that Anthony's led us on to, like what is horror even, like what is it about, and what is appealing in a horror movie, and what is affecting, at least, or what what are we left with? And I think it's weird, now what I'm arriving at too is I'm thinking of movies, that I consider some of my favorites. Okay, Monkey Shines, sure, but also like The Thing, which Kirk mentioned, also like Alien, which is kind of more sci-fi genre as well. But obviously, I think horror, and I think we think of like the body horror like of this era as well, like in this era of practical effects, these kind of things, these images that you're kind of left with, that those are moments I think of that are traditionally terrifying moments that do, horrify me or stick with me, that I still think about. I'm thinking too about like Nightmare on Elm Street, the very ending of that, where anyway, I won't spoil it, but there's kind of last minute jump scares, last minute scares that involve things you didn't think were possible, these kind of physically off-putting, kind of things. And this movie does have that, I think, in the form of like, in a way that felt kind of inexplicable, again, with the demise of Evil Ed, which again went on for so long. It was so gruesome as he transforms bit by bit back into a human and is still pulling the steak out of his body. Anyway, crazy. But I still think like, let's think about like, compare it to some of those other movies from the 80s, compare it to those classics. I still think just that like, I still have to take points off for like that beginning and the generic quality of it. And like, like that, like Evil Ed's like transformation into being a vampire. Okay, I like how it's kind of pulled off with Chris Sarandon literally like, wrapping his in kind of in the classic way, and as sort of an homage to the classic, vampire story. Chris Sarandon wrapping his like literally his like 80s like car leather jackets around him, and cloaking him like that. But it's just like it wasn't justified on a screenplay level. I felt like it had no explanation. It didn't. And so I was kind of checked out, so if it were not for those, moments at the end, those crazy moments, that again, I think with so many horror movies, it's like we like them in spite of themselves, but anyway, but I'm going off on many tangents here. There's a lot of things floating around in my mind. It's still not resolved. I'll have to think about this, but I would say it's a no. I would say it's a no for me. Though I was surprised by how much I did like it at the end. But I do think that in my heart, I believe there are other like 80s movies of this type that might be even better, that don't have some of the script issues. But I have to say that if the test is to have images that will remain, I assure you the images of Chris Sarandon dancing in the club will remain in my head for a long time to come. So.
Yes, we all long to be in his arms as he's swinging around. All right.
None of our three Halloween movies have made it.
I was about to ask. Yeah.
None.
And also very unusual that Tony likes my movie and the other two don't. It's not always that way. It's usually the reverse, I feel like.
Well, it's not a piece of crap like Transit. Yuck. This was an actual good movie.
Yeah, classic. All right. Well, we're moving on to Tony's favorite season, Tony's favorite month, November, the post-Halloween episodes. So we're to go through to the fan favorite section, which these three nominate a movie, claiming their decades as they do so that others cannot do, and we'll see what we have to watch for the next week. So who went least recent?
I did. I'm on a bit of a losing streak.
Right.
I'll go first, and then let's have Connor go second. Tony can go third. And yeah, decade rules apply. If I claim a decade, nobody else can touch it. So that's why I want to go first. Last week, I got kind of bit by that. And yeah, I feel like this is a unique opportunity, folks. How many episodes have we done? 5,000. There's only a few times where I've been so kind of off my game. I haven't been putting up winners. And, I've run cold, as they say. So, looking to bounce back with some situational sympathy from Mr. Anthony. And what better time than to nominate, I think I've nominated it before, but to nominate once again, my favorite movie of all time, Titanic. It's an episode that has to be made one way or another. And why not now? Why not here? A classic. It could be like an Avatar 2 special or something. I don't know. We could tie it in somehow, but looking forward to the potential of that episode because it will be spicy, certainly. Particularly, I want to hear what Connor has to say about Titanic. But anyways.
All right. Interesting renomination, Kirk. Connor?
Okay. Well, I'm really not sure about this, but I'm going to go with my heart. And I'm also going to renominate. Not something that I've nominated, but something that Anthony's nominated. I know this is a little cheap. I hope Kirk won't take this the wrong way. But I'm talking about 1955's Kiss Me Deadly, sort of obscure, short, kind of low-budget noir film that is obviously has a cult following and that Anthony knows all about, so I don't even know how to describe it. But let's just say that it embraces the campiness of noir. It embraces the kind of all of the strengths. I mean, it's so self-aware of itself as a noir movie. And it has this appeal that is so hard to describe. It feels so fresh, so different from the mainstream Hollywood noir films. Ralph Meeker as the ultimate brute of a protagonist, and an absolutely incredible ending. I mean, you won't fucking believe what happens at the end of this movie. So yeah, that's my pick. I know it's, I don't know if it's unprecedented to recommend something that someone else has seen. So Anthony suggested it. I rejected it. I think I was the one who was up to pick it. But then I wrote it down and I watched it much, much later and I just fucking loved it. So I think it would be really cool to watch it for the podcast. I think it's worth it. I think we all could have a great discussion. I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass, Anthony. Please understand where I'm coming from here. And yeah, that's my pick.
I checked the bylaws. This is actually illegal.
I renominated Cloud Atlas after Anthony nominated it, so it's not the first time it has happened. So,
okay,
yeah, it's common with my movies. My movies are slow burns; they appreciate it much later. Okay, so Tony, you have tough competition. What do you have?
All right, I guess it's official, guys. We're out of movies. We're out of movies to nominate because I'm renominating a movie myself. However, this is a movie I nominated many years ago when we started this thing in my garage in 1991. Talked about a little band called Nirvana, which had just come through town on that first episode. So I'm renominating Lee Chang-dong's Secret Sunshine. This is a Korean drama. So Lee Chang-dong, for the fans at home, is the director of Oasis, which is one of, if not my favorite movie of all time. We've done an episode on that one. And he has done a number of other films, and this is one of them. I don't know what to say. It's about a woman who is dealing with grief. It's not a very high concept movie, It doesn't really have a catchy log line to sell you on it. This is a movie that really just has to kind of be experienced. I believe it's 2.5 hours. His movies are basically like all 2.5 hours. Yeah. And they're that long because you need to settle into the atmosphere, to settle into the world, and for him to just really sell that feeling of naturalism that he's so adept at conveying. Oasis is actually something of an outlier in that it's his most kind of melodramatic work. His other films are a lot more kind of naturalistic. They deal with heightened subject matter in certain cases, of course, but this is a much more kind of down-to-earth, naturalistic film in Oasis, but it still has that emotional impact and is very powerful in its own right. And it's got great characters, great writing. It's just one that I think would be really cool to discuss. And I'm really curious to see what Anthony and Kirk think of it. I know Connor has seen it, but I'm curious to hear what all your takes are.
Yeah, I think last time you said you were especially interested in Kirk's like moral reaction to it or kind of ethical thing. He also did Burning, I think, right? Kind of, okay. Very interesting choices, I'll say. It's probably not just because I'm the one picking it, one of the best and tougher nominations I think we've seen. Very, very good stuff going around. Everyone picked a personal favorite. Let's see, Kirk. What do you have to say in defense of Titanic? And do we need to dust off the double VHS set to watch this movie?
Yeah, I know specifically where it switches over. It's right after he gets arrested, I believe. Or no, they find the diamond in his pocket. It's a great scene. Things are heating up. The boobies, by the way, that's tape 1. The car scene is tape 2, but there's no boobs. So you want to, if you're gonna pick a tape, and also please be considerate, rewind or fast forward so the next person that puts it in, they don't know what you were up to. But you just put it in, and he's like, draw me like one of my French girls, it's just, or your French girls. But no, Titanic, talk about horror. Like, there are some horrifying moments in this movie. If you're afraid of drowning, being on a sinking ship, and Connor, you said about your movie, you don't see the ending coming. I don't know if many people do see the ending coming in Titanic. The ship, well, actually, I shouldn't spoil it. They may or may not make it to New York successfully. But what is there to say? Titanic shouldn't be a critically acclaimed film. It was. I think people nowadays like to kind of scoff at it, and they like to think it was just this soulless husk that was created in the late 90s, and people had different sensibilities, and they weren't maybe as emotionally mature, or I don't know, or as artistically, like there was this kind of period of waning artistic sensibilities. But I think Titanic has the chops to stand up to most movies that are in this vein. For me, it makes me cry every time at the end. I think ultimately I watch movies to feel an emotional reaction, or to experience some form of transcendence. But it does it for me. I think the score is phenomenal. It's one of the best scores. I think the effects for the time period are also phenomenal. The way they did this in this huge indoor, basically pool. Say what you want about James Cameron, but he really put his heart into this and soul into this film. And I think it does hold up. I really do. I mean, some people that are just jaded assholes would say it's corny, but that's okay. I think there's something for everybody. I think it's okay for us to push back against the idea that just because something's popular means it's blasé or just prosaic. I don't think that's the case here. I think there is some emotional depth, and the performances. I mean, it's Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet, Billy Zane, Kathy Bates, the old lady who's most assuredly dead, though I never looked it up. She can't be alive. Anyways, long-winded, and also, if you do pick Titanic, I will have some twists and turns as host. Needless to say, very excited if it were to be chosen.
All right, very good defense, Kirk. I gotta say, real quick, when I was a kid, and I used to go down to Rosarito, visit family, the boat that was used as the kind of Titanic ship was still on the beach. So I have a very special childhood memory of that. But anyway, let's keep going. Connor, why should we do yours?
What can I say? I mean, I can't say anything against the other ones. Well, actually, yes, I can. Titanic, we have to save a spot for Avatar. It's too similar to Avatar, kind of takes up a slot. So I think we have to not do Titanic. No, I'm kidding. Of course, its popularity is interesting, right? It is intriguing, and it's been a long time for me from having seen it. It would practically be like seeing it for the first time, again. So, I mean, I am very interested in it. And as for Secret Sunshine, I'm surprised it's Tony's pick. I myself am a little bit Chang Donged out. I've been watching a lot of Lee Chang Dong's films. I do have to say, though, I mean, he's an incredible director. And I think his filmography is something that deserves a lot more attention as like one of the greats. I mean, he really is one of the coolest directors working out there. I know I was, it sounds like I'm kind of walking back what I just said about Secret Sunshine. It's a good movie, not my favorite of his, but interesting nevertheless. And as for Kiss Me Deadly, obviously Anthony has his own reasons, I'm sure, for liking it when he recommended it to begin with. But I just think this is a movie that is like, to me, is like, as a film lover, is like just a shot of adrenaline. Just gets me back into movies. It gets me excited about what movies can do. It gets me excited about genre conventions, about this. It gets me immersed in being a movie watcher, and to love being a movie watcher and being a cinephile. I love it for that. That's all I'll say.
Would you say it's a love letter to movies, Connor?
I wouldn't say that. It is a dirty glance from across the bar to movies. That's what it is.
Nice. Very good. Very good. Tony, what do you have to say about Secret Sunshine?
What I'd say about it? Well, I've seen both the other ones. Kiss Me Deadly. They're both merit episodes, I think. I like them both. Kiss Me Deadly is cool. Although I think I'm not quite as high on it as Connor, I don't think, but it's definitely like a cool and interesting movie, and I definitely want to see it again. Titanic, I think, is definitely merits an episode, and I kind of want to agree with Kirk on, people are so averse to cringe. There's aspects to Titanic that are cringe, I would say, and there's aspects about it that I do personally kind of consider corny, that I don't love. But I think this aversion to cringe or aversion to sincerity and the old David Foster Wallace thing, right? I think that like the only way to say something true is to risk being cringe. And I think that you can be jaded and too cool for school and call it cheesy, but I think it's more interesting to actually watch the movie for what it is and try to understand why it was so popular. And I also really admire, James Cameron's filmography. I think he's, one of the most talented people at that level in Hollywood. And I think it merits serious discussion. So I would definitely be down to do a Titanic episode or a Kiss Me Deadly episode. But as for Secret Sunshine, I mean, it's kind of the least sexy, the least exciting, choice perhaps. But I think we just did like a big fun romp, even if Kirk and Connor just were too cool for school, too jaded. They were the anti-Titanic boys, scoffing their heads at it. But you always need to make time for something slow, something contemplative. And I think that there's not a clear precedent, a really clear analog to Secret Sunshine in terms of other movies we've done. Even Oasis, as I've said, it's got a pretty different tone, pretty different vibe. But I think that the movie is a very rich experience, visually beautiful, emotionally resonant. And I don't know, I think it's time to kind of return to that space and that feeling, especially after something like Fright Night, which is so kind of goofy and so kind of silly and fun.
All right, let's see. So it's very tough. I'm a little surprised at Tony's understated reaction to Kiss Me Deadly, to be honest. I think it's a fascinating, cool, amazing movie that definitely warrants an episode. Secret Sunshine sounds interesting. I obviously wasn't as into Oasis, I think, as Tony is. I did love Burning though, actually, and I think that was the one that didn't work for Tony. So maybe I need to give another shot.
I'm pro Burning now, having rewatched
pro Burning.
I'm quite pro, yeah.
Okay, so maybe there's something else in his filmography that I need to gravitate towards. Titanic is fascinating. Kirk's been talking about it for 6 years now that we've known him. So I feel like that's something in his favor. At the same time, the cultural reasons Tony was bringing up, it is kind of fascinating that it comes out at a time of, as Connor would say, is quote unquote an end of history, a grand moment of irony. And yet it's some of the most sincere, cringeworthy moments there is. Okay, so this is tough. I think I'd want to do Kiss Me Deadly, to be honest, but I will give Kirk the sympathy here, because if we don't do it now, we're not going to do it in a long time. And also, I haven't seen it in a long time. So like Connor said, I feel like it'll be a renewed experience. So Kirk, let's do Titanic.
I'll take it. I don't care. I'll take it. I'm
This will-
excited. I haven't watched it in a while.
Will this be
Maybe
the longest
fits.
movie?
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
Wait,
yeah.
now how long is that?
Kagemusha was 3 hours. There's a few 3 hour ones in the
Okay.
mix.
One of mine, obviously. But not-
Yeah, it might be as longer
Also-
than Little Big Man. Yeah. But no, I appreciate it. I appreciate it, Anthony. I know I can always count on you to bring this full circle. And this will be the episode where we blow up. I can feel it. People have been hankering for some Titanic buzz, especially from our subreddit. It's been most requested. Very excited.
Nice.
Anthony, what take us out?
I'll have what she's having.